Mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, veuillez accueillir, please welcome Rémi Bastien, Kulveer Ranger, Karl Simon, en conversation avec, in conversation with Alejandro Zamorano.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our panel about data. We're going to be talking about how data should be owned, who should own it. We'll talk a little bit about data security. We'll talk a little bit about data sharing challenges. We'll try to focus the conversation on transportation and mobility. We'll try to talk about cities as well. And I think we're very lucky to have the panelists here. So let me start with a few fun factoids around data before we kick off the conversation. So at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, we counted roughly 6.5 million cars sold just in the first quarter of 2019 with embedded telematics. That was roughly 40% of new car sales in that quarter. So, that technology is advancing pretty fast. A connected car can generate roughly 20 gigabytes of data each hour. The data is ultimately processed in data centers, which in the US consume close to 100 billion kilowatt hours of electricity. About 10% of all road accidents in the US could be prevented through connectivity between vehicles, if vehicles could communicate with each other. And cities are increasingly using data to improve congestion. And in some cases, they've talked about improving congestion by about 10%, thanks to connectivity. So the impact is huge in a whole bunch of different aspects. And we have great stakeholders in this industry here. I'll start with Rémi, who has been working with Renault Innovation for decades, but he's now actively involved with VEDECOM, trying to figure out basically how to improve the way data is produced, the way data is managed, and the carbon footprint of the way that data is being processed. We have Kulveer, who is representing a leader in the digital transformation, Atos. He actually can explain to you technology without getting into the weeds of technology, so it should be a very pleasant conversation. He thinks a lot about impacts of technology in the long term. And we have Karl from the US EPA, who is leading, among many other projects, implementation of plans to improve air quality. So he's actually on the front working in initiatives to fix potential problems that will come from all this energy required to process and manage all this data. I've divided the conversation into three basic components. The first one is we're going to talk about generating data. The second one is we're going to talk about using data, and then we're going to talk about the future, what could go wrong and what could work. I've left about 9 minutes at the end to answer some questions from the audience. So please use the Click app. I have my iPad here, and I'll read them when the time comes. So let's get to it. Rémi, explain to us in the simplest possible manner how cars generate data, where the data goes, and how the data gets used today.
Okay, so the car can collect a lot of data. The point is always to have data of quality. And the car makers promote what we call extended vehicle in order that this data would be available for all the different company or business who can offer services to the customers, but not directly picking up the data from each individual vehicle, but to send this data through a server, meaning that they can support data of quality, and then the different companies can access to this data and then offer different services. This, I think, is key in order to prevent any easy hacking of the car or influence of the vehicle, and at the same time, it's offered the good way to access to this data.
Kulveer, tell us what happens then once an entity gets all this data. What type of empowerment comes with it?
Yeah, look, it's interesting because we're talking about a car, but we could be talking about any moving vehicle. And the car is basically a thing. And if we think of the term that maybe a lot of people have heard, IoT, Internet of Things, we're talking about connecting the car and everything that's happening in that vehicle to something else. It's generating a lot of data, yes. It's talking about how fast it's going. You know, my car's now smarter than me because it keeps telling me slow down, speed up, change lanes, do all this stuff. It's analyzing that information. But it's becoming intelligent. And the question is, how are we going to use that intelligence? Because we can talk about data as much as we want and the amount we're going to create and what's creating it. But it's utilization of that and the access to utilizing that. Because the real challenge here is, and I can barely see people, but does everyone know about the cloud? Yeah? So the cloud exists, it's up there, things go there, things come back, we're all quite safe now, you don't need to put anything on hard drives and stuff. But how about if there's too much information to go to the cloud? And that's what's happening with these cars, right? Cars are generating all this. It's going to get to a point, there's too much. But they need to talk to each other, they need to talk to the smart highways. So the challenge for us is how are we going to make these things do intelligent things and how we're going to manage that data. And by the way, the answer is not going to be in the cloud. It's going to be at the edge. And it's about edge computing. Because more and more, in the next few years, we're going to generate so much data that it's inefficient to move it all to the cloud and then analyze, process, decide what's going to happen, and send it back to the car to tell it to slow down, speed up, move lane. It has to happen in the vehicle, on the train, in the motorbike, as we're doing it. And it'll center around us. So that's going to be a real shift in how we manage the data and the decision-making and where it happens.
We'll talk a little bit more about that. I think Rémi has some pretty interesting views on that point. But I want to ask Karl, why is data from cars or from other things that are moving important for the EPA? What role does it play within the EPA today, and how are you using it, and what are you trying to achieve with it?
Yeah, so the data process that we're going through and the collection of all this data that my colleagues have talked about, it's really important for us as we're trying to make decisions on public policy, where to spend our resources, where to focus programs. We're in the midst of not just a data revolution, but in transportation, where we have another 3 revolutions, maybe 4 depending on who you're counting, but autonomous, connected, and electric. All of those are going to be very data intensive. So how do we use that information to design funding streams, new funding streams? Where do we think about congestion mitigation practices, air quality benefits, technology changes? All of this will be very data driven. And I think the exciting part about this is, and I know we're going to talk about data bias and making sure we know what we're collecting and collecting the right stuff, but also just it gives the ability for us to really think about a real world feedback loop. You know, we'll have some choices to make in terms of what that frequency is, but instead of estimating how performance will be and trying to hope that you get it and then correcting around an iterative decision, now you find yourself with the ability to do things on a quarterly basis, an annual basis, based on actual performance, which is a really powerful and I think a really hopeful potential public policy option for us.
And Kulveer, going back to you, how do we think about business models and be as creative as you want answering this question? Because there are a whole bunch of incumbent companies already. You have telcos, you have companies like Amazon now that are offering cloud computing services. You have the cars that are working with the telcos and embedding their telematics so that they can communicate through a modem. So there's a whole bunch of incumbents, but there are also a whole bunch of new companies that are emerging for the purpose of processing data for final users. Call it a city or call it a government entity whatsoever. Yeah. How do you think about that? How do you think about those businesses?
Yeah, look, and here's the plug from my sponsor, Atos. All right, look, we and other technology companies of our size and scale have spent the last set of decades managing data for other businesses. Mainframes, supercomputers, cloud services, hybrid, and now the edge. And increasing the power of processing and analyzing and then utilizing machine learning and AI. These are all skills that our business, others do. But you're right, there's the disruption from people who are actually changing the whole way that the business model of what's going to be done with the data. So it's not a case of just housing it and looking after it and creating a data lake and giving it to someone else. Now it's a question of application. And the biggest challenge actually is not the data, and it's not even what you're going to do with it. We know it's, you can do almost anything with the data, but it's the adoption. What are people going to allow you to do, right? What are people going to feel comfortable for you to do with the data? And maybe just a little thing, if I can say, previously I worked for the Mayor of London. I was the Mayor of London's transport advisor from 2008 to 2012. And before that, I worked on a program where we launched a smart card platform in London, the Oyster Card. That was 2003. One of the big things that enabled Transport for London to do was have lots of data. But in that era, data was considered, not as valuable, shall we say. It was a bit dangerous. It was like, oh my God, privacy was the #1 issue. It's still an issue. But we felt this data had to be locked away, hidden, secured. Nothing could be done with it. You fast forward a decade or so, and now people are thinking about, we can do something with that data. We can model it. We can analyze transport patterns. We learn a lot about what's going on operationally, but also what people want to do, and how we can build and change the system. That was around 2012, 2013. But now we're at a point where it's not the system operators who are looking at the data, it's the individual, the personal mobility. So I can be incentivized. It's gamification. It's telling me, hey, here's some additional value for you from your data directly to me, not via the body that potentially is housing it, but by other organizations and how I choose to use it. So really the change here is data is becoming personal, the service is becoming personal, and mobility is becoming personal because we are now getting more control and power over what we want to do with it.
Rémi, when we, based on what Kulveer said, and as businesses emerge where they want to monetize data, basically, somehow, you can't ignore the safety and privacy, question.
Sure.
And you mentioned earlier the notion of the extended vehicle, the importance of protecting the data on the extended vehicle. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what that means and how you're thinking about it?
Yes. No, I can come back on that. The point is, if we want to take advantage of the data, we must make sure to have data of quality. This is one reason. And the second is regarding safety. If anybody can access easily to each individual car, you can imagine that the consequence in terms of cybersecurity protection will be important. Many people consider that now a car is a mobile phone on wheel. I will say it's different. If someone access to your mobile phone, it could give disagreement. But if it comes in a mobile that can be driven, you can imagine the consequences in terms of crash and so on. So for us, it's very important to consider that we can prevent such case. And the way to solve this problem is to deliver this data through a server where we cut this kind of risk.
Karl, in your unique position in a government agency, how do you look at this data that you're getting a hold from transport, and how do you assess, okay, these are some positive things we can do with this data, but these are some really negative things that we do not want to do with this data? How do you balance those two? Because your mandate is not just to maximize profit through a new business that you could build with that data.
Yeah, no, that's a really important question, and I think you get at it in a couple of different ways. Is that you make sure that you're very transparent with what you're trying to do with it, so that not just the stakeholders know, but other people that may be tangentially affected. So public comment process, being able to have conversations with the data providers, the analysts. Our role is to protect information. After that, it's in our interest to get it out and have people talking about it. I think what Kulveer talked about and what Rémi's talked about is this pool of data. I like that analogy. Think of it like weather data in the U.S. 20 years ago was very government driven, and then it was put out for people to kind of go figure out what to do with it. I think you can have the same impact, and then you're starting to see that in the mobility space where people are doing products around that data. So for us to be able to highlight the things that matter from a public policy perspective and be transparent about it is really important. And then the rest of it will kind of sort itself out.
And when we talk about data, we forget about the energy density required to manage, process, and transmit data, right? And I think you have some pretty interesting views on that, Rémi, and then I'll go to Kulveer as well, and Karl. But tell us a little about, explain the problems around the energy requirements and the negative externalities that those could have in the long term.
Okay. Because I'm lucky to be chairman of a research institute, it deals with science, and ever the science deals with experiments, with data. But I think with the machine learning, the researcher should be encouraged also to consider how not, to collect a huge amount of data and then take this easy tool, machine learning. It's important that they could also raise the right mathematical models. Why? Because today, if internet would be a country, it would be the number 3 using energy behind US and China. The other magnitude I have in mind is 1,500 terawatt hours per year, which is huge. And the point on that is how we can be more frugal to use the appropriate data. I will take just an example. For autonomous driving, there is more and more way to take advantage of data. You can see that each prototype has a lot of sensors. In the trunk, there is big computers that today, with GPU, use more than 3 kilowatts to deal with that. And we exchanged that before. We invested in a French startup. The name is Prophecy. They analyze how the nature take the image. And a human eye, do not collect the complete image 24 times per second, but only the pixel that changes. This means that the brain, your brain, is not saturated by the full images, and it is a way to cut by a factor 100, 1,000 or more the flow of data. So I mean, it's very important in events like Movin'On to understand that data are very precious, but we must be careful to be frugal. The other magnitude I said, every 4 years, the energy necessary for this flow of data doubles. So if we don't take care of that, you can imagine the impact on the CO2 and the climate. So it's very important to take advantage of this data, but the right one, and also to try to be frugal.
Karl, what initiatives are you involved within the EPA to try to fix is probably not the right word, but to reduce the impact on energy consumption that these huge data processing facilities have in the US?
Yeah, so I think it's a really important question that's brought up here. So we think you work with our state partners, so California and New York are 2 examples of, I think, states that are really trying to push the envelope a little bit in terms of this connectivity and taking data from an experiment. So New York City's been doing some really interesting things in terms of what the impact of the transportation network companies have been on their traffic patterns. And this data, if anybody's tried to drive around in Manhattan lately, probably isn't surprising, but being able to parse that out and think about what that is. But it gets to the question I think we've all been talking about is, just because you can collect it doesn't mean you should. So the hard part is figuring out what you can do and being thoughtful about what that is to reduce not only the noise in the data, but also the impact on the emissions. So thinking about other models through Department of Energy as energy incentive contracts as well, things like that.
So bringing this to you, Kulveer, and there's always talk about data in, but results out, right?
Yeah.
If we're changing the way that data is being processed, if more data is being processed on the edge, the way we collect that data has to change as a result.
Yeah. Absolutely.
How do you anticipate that?
I want to say we sound like we might be talking a bit down.
Yeah.
Right. It's actually a really exciting moment in time. Okay, because I got the feeling we've been kind of, oh no, it's a problem, the challenge, sustainability absolutely is the silent conversation that I think broadly the public haven't understood around data, the usage, processing power. But we as a business, for example, Atos, our supercomputing is built to be more sustainable. We actually put sustainability at the heart of all the solutions. We have to, the problem is looming large. We must be aware of that. So I just want to touch on that bit. All responsible people involved in the technology business are considering the impact on the environment, the impact of energy, and the impact on CO2 about using this. But the exciting thing is, around the edge and what's happening at a personal level. We talk about cars, but actually, 2 decades ago, a phone was a phone was a phone. A decade from now, what's your car going to be? Right? Is it going to be a moving office? Is it going to be a moving meeting place? Is it a place you're going to go and watch films in with other people? What are you going to do in this thing? So the whole exciting part is, what are we going to get from it? And that's why we produce papers like this, A Digital Vision for Mobility, where we want to see where we're going to go in the near future, because that's the exciting thing. And what I personally think is going to happen is public mobility, public transport is becoming personal mobility. Now, I want to give a real-life example. This morning in Montreal, anyone got stuck in traffic? Yeah? All right. I heard many reasons. There's okay, the F1 is happening. Right? That always has a bit of an issue in a city. There's a lot of roadworks, a lot of building going on in Montreal. All big cities that are successful and prosperous, this happens. But still, I was at our hotel waiting to come here, and I think Carla, we were both there. She's in the audience, I believe. And we were told, our shuttle's coming. We wait. Doesn't come. We ask, not sure what's happening. Eventually, it's stuck here because there was something going on the side. Shuttle can't get out. Panic level starts to get higher. I've got to be in this seat in about 45 minutes. What am I going to do? Why don't you get a taxi? Didn't even bother thinking about an Uber because my phone isn't quite used to using Uber in Montreal. We get a taxi. How long is it going to take? No idea. What's it going to cost? Who knows? Get there, pleasantly surprised. 15 minutes, $15, I'm here. Not bad, huh? But how much control did I have?
Zero.
What did I know? Absolutely nothing. I was blind. Mm-hmm. Now, the convergence that's happening is all those systems that could be there. That actually, my diary knows where I've got to be, where I'm going to travel. The Movin'On app could link into that. It could send me a note saying, hey, there's a problem there. The hotel could say, hey, we got a taxi ready, or this is the cost of it, and this is what time it's coming, and you're going to go, we're that far away from it. But that's the aggregation, and this is the most important word, the aggregation that we have to do in this era of platforms to get to that level of real personal mobility. That's where we're going to, city, organizations, private platforms, startups, coming together, linking up to give us personal mobility. And that's what I'm really excited about. That's, I think, what's going to give us real new services, efficiency, cost effectiveness, sustainability, and a bit of fun.
Yeah, you have.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think more and more we will see that the intelligence will not be purely stocked inside the vehicle, but will be shared between infrastructure and vehicle, and it will be a condition to have safe, autonomous mobility, and also easier one. If we place everything inside the vehicle, we have the Christmas tree of sensors and many things. If we balance the intelligence between infrastructure and the vehicle, we have a chance to have it more affordable, more safe, and we are at a period where this connection, this cooperation between the different functions could really bring big value.
Yeah, and we didn't talk about, this is all about personal mobility today, but think about the freight sector too, and moving goods. The same level of excitement and the same high level of uncertainty about what the world will look like 10 years from ago, but I like the positivity in terms of because I do believe that we are at that point, and giving people that choice and understanding what their choices impact are and driving more sustainability into your daily existence, I think will be really helpful.
And sticking a little bit on that point, nobody really expected the negative externalities of cars in cities when cars were first adopted, right? We didn't think congestion was going to get so bad, to the point that it's having an impact on motorization rates, and it's even having an impact on urbanization rates that has been consistent for, I don't know, 500 years. What are some of those externalities? You now have access to a whole bunch of data. You're using the data to make, to inform your decisions that could eventually become policies. How do you think about those externalities that we didn't think about cars, which were such an optimal and amazing solution 80 years ago? How do you think about those?
It provides this cusp of the revolution that we're on here provides you with those opportunities to think about different things and to think about really what kind of a city do you want to live in. So thinking about it, not just moving, a person from A to B, but how that person gets dropped off. What are those systems? When are they going to come in? You can be a lot smarter about this. You can have central drop-off zones. You can have curbside management becomes a much better issue to address. So you really can, I think, step back and think about it in a more holistic sense, because you really have a chance now to design kind of that livable city that you want to work with, thinking about those externalities, where before, we were all blind to it, right? It was just getting people as fast as you can, point A to point B, and congestion came, we'll build another highway, we'll build another lane.
Yeah. And Kulveer, the way, at least in the US, most cities were designed based on the way cars were being used, and suburbanization happened as a result, and the way the highways were built, as Karl was mentioning, was due to that. If we're now going into this future of hyperconnectivity, where at some point there's an entity that knows where everything is, how do you, and that changes constantly, how do you manage the different time frames of at which the technology gets developed and adopted with the way a city planner builds a city, or sources to build infrastructure for a city?
It's a great question, Alejandro, because in my role at City Hall a couple of bits of time ago, we have a policy called the Mayor's Transport Strategy, a 10-year document that looks at the strategy of a city of London. And I think most cities have something like that, a master plan around what's happening with land use and what's happening with infrastructure around transport, and how do you overlay the two. There's a third element now. There's the technology, the intervention of technology, and that has to be fundamental to every strategic decision that any city makes. Karl's talking about how do you want to live in a city, what is the function of a city. That's changing so drastically. When cars were first brought forward, do you know, for safety reasons, in England at least, a person would walk in front of the car with a flag to let people know that the car was coming. Then, in the 30s and 40s, when cars were seen as the answer, roads were bulldozed into central London, the A roads, and most cities, Americans, freeways, built them all around the car. But now we're thinking more about how we're going to live, because the technology's changed the way we work, the way we use leisure time. We're not all going to the office at 9 and coming back at 5. We're doing different things at the center of a metropolis. We're finding life is being redesigned by services and technology, and that's going to have a huge impact on both how the city works, the environments work, and mobility works. So land use, infrastructure and transport, the services that technology provide now need to come together in any planning and strategic planning we do for a city.
Rémi, in your view, you spoke a little bit about autonomous vehicles, and the connectivity question comes very often when you're having that conversation as a huge enabler for autonomy. But there's still debate around it, and there's still debate around how reliable should autonomy be to connectivity, especially if you want to make it widely available around the globe at all times when you cannot guarantee connectivity. There's a little bit of evidence about this thought, and Elon said it in his Autonomy Analyst Day, where he's not going to depend on high-definition maps precisely because of that, because he cannot afford his robotaxis, as he calls them, to be so dependent on that data that is coming from the cloud. What's your view on that? Is connectivity probably the most important enabler for autonomy, or is it something else?
As I mentioned earlier, I do think that the intelligence should be also not restricted to the vehicle, meaning that in that case we must have reliable connection with the infrastructure. Every safe system requires redundancy, meaning that in that case we must issue redundant connections and think like a system of systems in order to ensure that in any case we can anticipate the critical cases and we take the right decisions in order to protect the passengers inside the car and also the other users. So I do think that, yes, the share of this data, the intelligence that can take advantage of these different sources using redundancy is certainly a key to ensure safety for this new type of mobility.
Okay. I think we're going to move to a few questions from the audience, and not to put you on the spotlight here, Karl, but should the government be in charge to provide public global data management service in a similar way as they are in charge of infrastructure management and building?
No.
Why not?
Because I think the points that Kulveer and Rémi have raised in terms of this is not just a government function here anymore. It's to take most advantage of the situation that we're going to find ourselves in to maximize the goals that we want for livability, sustainability, economic development. It really has to be a shared function, and finding that right balance of how you manage that data. And from a government perspective, we'll have a role both at the city, state, and federal level, or provincial, or whatever the governmental organization is. But it really has to be done in partnership at this stage to really maximize it, because then you're going to lose efficiency if it's just one entity.
Yeah.
Can I add to that? I think you're right, and there's a question here about, and sorry if I'm jumping in, but on will the users have more control on the data? Is this true? Can data be erased? How can consent be given in full awareness, right? And this is what people are worried about. Is this really real? Am I going to have the power over my own data? And as city planners, as civil servants, as industry, yeah, we're talking about all of this stuff. But there's a really important voice that the people must have in this conversation, and that's through our politicians as well. And I mean a positive conversation from politicians about the opportunity that digital services are going to give and the control people are going to have over these services. The challenge here is enabling the political world to understand it. They don't need to understand how a supercomputer works or what the data is doing, but they need to understand the implications of the services and how we're going to manage the responsibility between those who provide the service, those who use the service, and other third parties, a city and private organizations, who are supporting in the, I'm going to say the word, ecosystem. Because that is going to be an important part, some of it regulation, some of it public policy, and giving reassurance and power to the citizen. Just like in banking, we trust banks, but they're highly regulated, or some of us might not trust banks, there's a question, but there's a high amount of regulation and control. I'm not saying that's what's required here, but we must be having strong political positive voices that understand this world that's emerging and then give reassurance to the public about how they're protected.
Yes, in addition, I think for many purposes linked to mobility, and I think especially on the safety side, we don't need at all to know who is who. Anonymous data are exactly what we need. So the question of privacy is certainly one topic to protect, but for many safety functions, we simply need to have, let's say, anonymous data, and this, I think, is something that the public must also understand. We don't need to know who is who for everything.
But Rémi, I'll challenge you a bit on that, because the thing that happens is that people go, yeah, we want the anonymous data, but then someone will come to you and go, but if you tell me who you are, I'll give you a discount on your insurance. Yeah? If you tell me where you're going, I'll give you an incentive or a voucher on your route. Suddenly, the balance of autonomization and the value to you as an individual, and then what's the value to of that data starts to become a bit more gray. And we need to work out so that people get a fair understanding that when they opt in and they're giving something, what they're getting in return, and how that will be managed going forward.
I think we agree, but here you are on a service, on a win-win with each individual. Then they have the choice. I accept to share my data and I get something. My point was for, let's say, more citizen or territory stake. We don't need at all to have this. I mean, all the public services could work without private knowledge. When it turns to business, it is a win-win, and it's simply, I give you that, I get it, and that's it.
That's a key point, I think, and it's one of the questions here from the audience, and it is, what if, this data about your mobility, your personal data of where you move and how you move, yes, it could be used to optimize the way you move. A city could be optimizing traffic as a result of it, thanks to it. But then, it's very likely we're going to see a whole bunch of companies building services around it, similar to what social media does. I use data on you to help you connect with other people, but also to sell ads that are targeted to what you like and what you do not like. So if all this data on mobility, which in theory is anonymized, but to be able to monetize it so that it becomes better and more efficient and you can optimize it, you need to build businesses around it. How do you balance those two? And maybe Karl, do you want to?
Yeah, so that's a tough question for us as the government. I would say that we have an incentive not to collect that personalized data because that the rules that are in place for us to protect it now ratchet up, and I don't think we need it for most of the issues. So there are models out there for third-party aggregators. There's models for people to be intermediaries for that data. Perhaps there's a governmental role in that, helping to kind of at least triage and have some initial collection and then gets manipulated. So I think there's different ways to come at that question, but it's a challenging one. And I think the value that we have now and where we're trying to figure out what that new sustainable, really hopeful future is, it's going to be different things for different people. So I'd hate to kind of have one group say, well, here's the data and we're going to restrict it and then go figure it out, because we really don't know what we want to do in many instances. So having that experimentation and letting London go do things and find out that they didn't work so that other cities can learn and vice versa is really important at this stage in the revolutionary process that we're going through.
Kulveer, do you think that's the hill to conquer, the privacy question?
It comes down to one word, and it's not data. Yeah. It's trust. We have to engineer the right amount of trust that people feel confident in the services that they're using, in the options they're opting into, in the preferences that they're providing, in the facial recognition that's capturing them, in the access that they're giving to their diary, to their lifestyle, to everything. They must trust that where that data is going and how it's going to be utilized puts them at the center and value for them first. And I fundamentally believe that that's what's going to be driven through, because over the last 20 years, I've spent time in both the public and private sector. And you win when you win people's trust, and then they feel more confident and adopt and allow more freedom for innovation and new stuff to happen. And we've seen it happen. I don't want to mention all the big social media platforms and everything else that people ran to use because they trusted them. They were getting some really good engagement feedback. There's been a bit of a wobble there. People are concerned about what some of these organizations are doing. We must build trust. And personal mobility is going to be such a huge part of that because it verges on the government, the city authority, and has such a huge play for every single person. That trust is going to be at the heart of it. So the mayors, the politicians, the civil servants all have to play their part to engineer trust for people, and then people will feel confident about it.
Well, I think that does it for today. Thank you very much. Please give us a hand to our panelists. And I think we're all sticking around, so if you want to connect with them, feel free to approach them. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's